on our panel, The Future of Cryptocurrency. I'm Rohan Grey from the Innovation Working Group. But before starting, I would like to emphasize the fact that this is a collaboration between 3 working groups, and I would like them to introduce themselves briefly. So, Céline from the Financial Stability Working Group.
Hi, and my co-coordinator is Miriam, and we've been interested in the topic of cryptocurrencies because of its potential financial stability implications, as Izabella will tell you about later.
And Céline is the one actually who pioneered the interest for cryptocurrency within the Y side. So she was the first one to launch the webinar on that. It's been almost a year now, and we'd like to pursue the research agenda. That's why we set up this panel today. Yes?
And hi, I'm Vasilina from the Innovation Working Group. The webinar last year had this interest about cryptocurrency, and we're so happy to collaborate with groups that have at least a certain vision of what is happening right now. And the Innovation Working Groups, just a little bit of introduction, since innovation has been central to economic development and growth, and wants to see over the long run how markets, institutions, and economic actors evolve over time. And we're very happy for this collaboration, and we also named, to a certain extent, this panel of research cryptocurrencies, and how to each one have different views and how to see cryptocurrency from an institutional point of view, mass public point of view, from a law and economics. Thank you.
Christopher?
Hi, I'm Christopher. I'm the board mate for the Finance Law and Economics Working Group, together with Cecilia, who is coming later today. So we're very happy because we have been running a webinar series until now. So there have been like around 5 sessions, and this afternoon we will have a cryptocurrency session dedicated to the young scholars. So they will present their work and with the mentors from the panel. So it will be a great opportunity for you guys to join and hear some of the feedback. Thank you.
And before introducing the speakers, I would really like to highlight the fact that we set this panel because we're not interested in like for or against cryptocurrency. I guess that most of you in the room here, you're a scholar doing master's, PhD, or postdoc, and I think the panel will be successful if at some point you kind of collaborate together and pursue the research agenda. So the speakers will really focus on what are the interesting research questions from their own disciplines, and what kind of empirical strategies they can implement to pursue that. So our first speaker would be Perry Mehrling. You probably know him from Economics of Money and Banking course. He's at Barnard College in Columbia. He will focus on explaining how money view is relevant to some cryptocurrencies. Then we have Izabella. She's now the new editor of the FT Alphaville. She'll bring up some really cool anecdotes about what's going on in the field of cryptocurrencies from the point of view of the players, and also she will bring up her historical perspective on it. And then Rohan, you're the law guy in this panel. He works, and he's the founder of the Modern Money Network. So thank you for being here, Perry. The floor is yours.
Well, it's great to be here. I just got in late last night, so I'm blinking a little bit. Although I don't have jet lag because I came from Warsaw, not from Boston. So I'm actually 1 hour behind, not 5 hours ahead, or the other way around. Cryptocurrency is something I've been interested in really ever since the beginning, because I do monetary economics, and I was trying to figure this thing out. And it's been a very challenging process. You may have noticed that the first thing I've ever written in public about that has just happened in the last few weeks, and INED picked it up on their webpage, called Cryptos Fear Credit, okay? And I think the reason it's taken me a while is because I haven't been able to figure out, they didn't have any sort of explicit monetary theory that I could engage with. It's all about computer programming and so forth. But I had a great fortune a few weeks ago that there was a workshop organized at Columbia University by Katrina Pistor, my law colleague, where we got a bunch of these Bitcoin and whatnot advocates in the room with some lawyers, and I was able to ask them, what is your implicit monetary theory? You know, how, and it was extremely revealing, okay? So now I really feel that I understand what is happening, okay? And so I'm going to tell you a viewpoint. My viewpoint. I mean, I think it's evolving. I think it's extremely, this is why I crystallized it in this little meme, crypto's fear credit, okay? Because I think that encapsulates a lot of what is important here. That the Bitcoin enthusiasts and others are a version of the digital gold bug who are, well, I'll say that and then I'm going to elaborate. They view money primarily as just a medium of exchange, okay? And they think it's sort of obvious that money is just a medium of exchange. They don't appreciate that there might be other theories, there might be other approaches. They think, and they quote sort of selectively from economics, like, well, as so-and-so says, such and such. So they're basically crypto monetarists also. I'm going to come back to this at the end. Because, so that's the first overview. And so they're digital gold bugs in the sense that they think money should be, there's no credit element in it at all. That's the point. So why do they fear credit? Okay. They're not particularly paranoid people, although the engagement with the cryptology and so forth does create a kind of paranoid mindset. You're always imagining, you know, the worst. What is somebody going to do? How are they going to crack my code? How are they going? So but they would like to create a world, okay, in which nobody has to trust anybody, okay. So they'll never get screwed by anybody because they've never trusted anybody, but no one has to trust anybody, and they imagine that as the realm of freedom, that we will be free because we won't have to trust each other. What are they really anxious about? Because they're actually nice people and they like each other, and they're not really automatons that are separate from society. They have their own little society, as a matter of fact. What they fear is concentrated power. They fear the way the monetary economy, the financial economy, has required us to trust Citibank, okay, or trust the government, okay, that because we don't know each other in large mass society, we have not IOUs with each other, but we trade in IOUs with the Federal Reserve, okay, or with Citibank, and that's what they're opposed to. So this is quite interesting phenomenon. One of the phenomena in society right now is discontent with global financialization. Cryptocurrency advocacy is a symptom of that discontent. That symptom shows up in a lot of other places, in our politics and in other places. But this is what I want to maybe, from a political economy point of view, from a cultural point of view, that cryptocurrency is maybe not an answer, but it's definitely a symptom. And so something to pay attention to for our society. So that's the second point. The third point. To the extent there's a monetary theory underlying this, okay, the main one that people seem to appeal to is this paper by an economist, Kocher Lakota, called Money is Memory. Okay, if you look at that paper, what you see he is imagining, okay, is that the reason that money is spending power, gives you ability to buy, is because it's a token showing that you have already sold something. Okay? That it's a social memory that you have already supplied some goods to society, and so now society is going to supply some to you. So it's very backward looking, right? It's backward looking. It's saying, how do I know that you're doing any good for anybody? Show me your wallet, okay? And you see the digital coins there, and it's, oh, I guess you must have sold something to somebody that they liked. I don't really know what it is you sold them, but here's a token, and I will therefore accept that from you and give you some goods. Okay. Credit is exactly the opposite, right? Credit gives you the ability to purchase today because of some prospect of doing something good for society or doing something in the future. You're making a promise. It's not from the past, it's from the future. This is, from my point of view, like 18th century economics. You know, really, it does not pay any attention to all of the shift in the cultural focus of economics from the past to the future, understanding the financial revolution as being anticipating future and capitalizing them back to the present, and that's what gives you access to credit. I think they appreciate that that's the way the financial system works. They just think it's bad, okay? And that it would be better to have a simpler, see, now my computer just went to sleep. That's not good. We got excuse me. I didn't have a chance this morning in the hotel to print this off. Okay, here we go. Fourth point. So they fear credit for these reasons: concentrated power, and they fear credit because credit is disruptive. Okay? Credit gives purchasing power to people who haven't earned it through past behavior. They imagine their own innovations are themselves disruptive. They're going to disrupt this big, horrible financial system, okay? But in fact, they're afraid of the disruptive quality of the credit system as it exists, and even simple credit systems are rather disruptive. So so my fourth point is that credit is key to the operations of monetary systems. Anyone who's seen my MOOC knows this, okay? But I'll just say, just reference that the main point that I make about the payment system is that it is essentially a credit system, okay? That people that there's an expansion of balance sheets, of bank balance sheets, of clearinghouse balance sheets during the day that then gets settled at the end. That's where the elasticity comes from. That makes it possible for us to then settle just with offsetting credits, not with money. Most actual payments are settled through offsetting credit balances, not through, oh, I see that you have proven from this money thing that you've done something good for somebody. That gives it elasticity. Okay. The discipline comes from if there is an imbalance, you have to settle that imbalance in money. Okay. But the imbalance is very tiny compared to the gross flow of payments. So it's an impossible payment system they're proposing because the actual payment system operates essentially on credit in much more way than they think. They think that money is a means of exchange. This is just not correct as an empirical fact about the world. Secondly, and they don't think about this at all, okay, that market making, where do these prices come from? These financial prices that are anticipated in the future and bring it down. There's a market making process. There are dealers who are offering bid-ask spreads. These prices come, and how do the dealers operate? They operate by bringing onto their own balance sheet imbalances between supply and demand, which they finance with credit. Okay, so again, we would not have financial prices, okay, if we did not have the ability of these speculative dealers to balance supply and demand by taking the opposite side and funding it with promises to pay in the future. That elasticity is crucial for financial stability. If you didn't have credit quantity absorbing these fluctuations in supply and demand, it would all be in price, okay? And so this is, now they don't recognize any of that, okay? Because none of them have taken the MOOC. Okay, but perhaps they will. What is going to make them? And the reason they haven't taken the MOOC, okay, is not because they don't work hard and they're not intellectuals. They definitely are hard. They are hard workers. It's because they don't think they have to, right? They think that they don't need to know anything about money and finance because they intend to replace it. They know about code. And so they're just going to recode the world into a better, beautiful world, okay? And everyone will see that it's better code, and they'll just adopt it, and away with Goldman Sachs. It'll all just go away tomorrow. Which is sort of, I don't know, innocent and naive, and maybe a little dangerous. You mean all those words because they don't understand the credit character of the economy as it exists. They're extremely vulnerable to exploitation by people who do understand how it works, okay? And that's what's happening now, okay? And you can see some of this Izabella is following this on FT Alphaville, where it's pretty clear, okay, that there is a credit network being built on top of Bitcoin and other things, where people are calling something a coin that is not a coin, that is a promise to pay a coin. And the people who are dealing with Bitcoin think it's a coin, and then it turns out there is no coin there. And so it's financial scams of various kinds that are happening. Tether is one example that we were talking about. We can talk maybe in some details. I would need to show you balance sheets and things like that to explain what is most likely going on there. So there is intermediation happening on top of crypto. Okay, in both the payments and in the market making. If you look at the mechanisms where you're exchanging one crypto for another, if you look at the firms that are promising to make markets essentially in foreign exchange, exchanging Bitcoin for dollars, those are dealers, okay? The economics of the dealer function, okay, applies to them. These are intermediaries. These are credit operations. And I think the people who designed this code have no idea, okay, that is actually what's happening behind the scene. Because I talked with them. They are not aware that their fear of credit has now put them in bed with people who see credit as a wonderful opportunity, unregulated credit, for taking advantage and fleecing the herd. So they're going to discover about credit, and they're going to discover how ignorant they are about credit, and it's going to end in tears. Okay. Finally, since this is a conference on new economic thinking, what is extremely interesting to me is that one of the things that will happen to the cryptos when they discover this is that they will become extremely interested in credit. Okay? And they will realize that their monetary theory, okay, is wrong. Okay? And that they have to find some new monetary theory, and they will go looking. And this is an opportunity not only, I mean, I'm an educator, so when people just say, oh, please teach me, that's my job. But this is about economists as well, because I pointed out to you, they think they have a monetary theory, okay? Crypto monetarist monetary theory, okay? Contra Lakota monetary theory. Money is a medium of exchange monetary theory. They think that's the right monetary theory, and there's plenty of economists who agree with them, okay? Because they wrote these papers, right? So this is going to create an opening for a larger conversation, not just about cryptocurrencies, but about what are the actual ruling principles of the monetary and financial economy we live in. It's going to open up space for dialogue, because we will see that the operating monetary theory to which they were pledging allegiance, and the monetary authorities in the economics profession to whom they are pledging allegiance, okay, are not correct. Okay, the world will show them this, and then there will be an opening, and that's what INET exists for. So I'm looking forward to that moment. I think it's sooner rather than later, but perhaps Izabella will give us. She has her finger on the pulse. Thank you.
Perry, thank you. That's a fantastic opening. I completely echo Perry's comments. What I've found fascinating in covering Bitcoin, first of all, is I've gained a reputation as being a sort of anti-Bitcoin critic, and I want to set the record straight, which is that I'm not anti it. I'm a journalist. I'm looking at it from a position of inquiry. I find it fascinating what's going on, mainly because I'm personally very interested in historical recurrence, and I just see this mostly as, I mean, you've already insinuated these are people who don't necessarily have any interest in the system as it already exists. They think they can recreate it without any study or comprehension of the existing paradigm at all, and they have a real kind of disrespect for history, I would say. So that is my starting point, and as the old adage goes, if you don't read or respect history, you're doomed to repeat the mistakes of history. And I really think that's what's happening here, and that's where I find that's where my interest lies. So one of the things that I've been focusing on is how over time Bitcoin started off as this utopian ideal. We were going to have a world without trusted intermediaries. We were going to have a world where you don't have to depend on any concentrated player, all that stuff. But increasingly, the exact opposite is happening. And so we've gone from a world of hard money, a narrow money universe, into the most expansive monetary universe that is out there. In terms of like the proliferation of coins at the moment, it is unstoppable, because whereas Bitcoin has a cap, what was not perhaps anticipated is that Bitcoin is entirely replicable. Therefore, you have no limit on how many people can issue their own currencies. And so now we're in this like hyper issuance moment. It's been dubbed the ICO phenomenon, and every man and his dog is issuing a coin. I could issue a coin, Perry could have a coin, we could all have like, and this is the ideal. This is the ideal in their world. Like you don't need a universal language of money, because everyone is going to be operating with their own money effectively. This creates so much complexity and is likely to introduce massive financial transaction costs, because let's face it, if everybody has to deal with everybody else's coinage, we have no idea of the value of anything. I mean, it's hard enough when you go abroad and you have to do like a basic, well, it is for me because I'm not an economist or a mathematician, but when you do a basic sort of conversion, but imagine having to convert, like even just trying to keep an eye on prices in Bitcoin is impossible. Which is why, funnily enough, in the cryptocurrency space, it's still the dollar that dominates. Everything is denominated in dollars. The language of crypto is still the dollar. It is not Bitcoin. Nobody goes around saying I have 0.03 Bitcoins. This just doesn't happen. But the other interesting thing that has manifested is the obsession with scale. So the ideal, as Perry described, was a world where you don't have to depend on a third party. IOUs are enough and to operate in the economy. No one has to depend on anybody else. But it turns out that sort of world doesn't scale. It's really hard to get traction with the larger consumer base if everyone has to be their own bank. Mainly because most normal people who have a job don't have time to spend 24 hours on Reddit every day making sure they're not victims of the next scam. Because really, to operate in this space, you have to have not only a computer, like to operate securely in this space, you need to have a computer degree, you need to have a basic financial knowledge of some sort, and you have to follow all the kind of social media day to day about every single person that might be a scammer or might not be a scammer, because you are completely exposed. There is no economy of scale in this system. And understandably, we have seen the manifestation of more third parties coming into the market than in any other sphere, but they are unregulated. So the irony of the crypto space is that it is not at all bilateral or P2P. It is dominated now by a handful of major crypto exchanges who operate as dealers but also as credit creators, because most people don't appreciate that when they hold their balances on a crypto exchange, they're holding IOUs of said exchange, not necessarily the underlying. There are different wallets where you can have like so-called segregated assets, but by and large, if you have a segregated wallet, you have the responsibility for that key. So if you lose the key, and this happens a lot. It happened to my very smart colleague, Kadim, who has a degree in physics from Imperial. He lost his key, and he's now, how many thousands of dollars short. So there is a big responsibility there, and this happens all the time. But what really is fascinating from an intellectual inquiry perspective is the fascination with scale. So the scale debate is something that is going on every single day in Bitcoin, because the objective is, how can we have our cake and eat it? A bilateral system, a peer-to-peer system that can still scale without the dependence on a third party. And as they replicate and try to create new systems, they are creating a layered sort of hierarchical money system. So the new concepts that are coming forward are things like the Lightning Network, which, as far as I can see, is a off-balance sheeting of the core Bitcoin clearing network. So you essentially you relieve the pressure on the core Bitcoin network by allowing trusted third parties to operate nodes where they clear amongst themselves. It's very reminiscent of the common banking network. But there's also other ironies that come into play. So not only are we more dependent on intermediaries than ever before, the people in this space end up having hilariously ironic circumstances fall upon them. So recently, there's a company called R3, which is a blockchain company. They're not a crypto company because they are actually extracting the blockchain, the technology of Bitcoin, and wanting to apply it to banking, because this is the other big thing. There is this presumption that there's been a massive innovation, and if only we can take out the proof of work function, which I would say is what Perry was referring to in terms of this idea that you can prove that the work has already been done. You are entitled to a credit in the social network because you have a demonstrable proof of work that shows you have committed some sort of energy, therefore, to X project. Whether it was worthwhile or not is irrelevant. you are entitled to operate. But the problem with proof of work is that it's really energy intensive, really expensive, and it cannot scale. So the future of Bitcoin and blockchain are systems that remove the proof of work function and therefore turn it into a pure credit system, because without the proof of work, it is no longer tied to the historical expenditure of any energy at all. It is entirely based on a trusted system. And so the core banking system wants to use blockchain without proof of work because it's cheaper and it fits better with a credit system. Except there's no real understanding of whether there's any other innovation that comes with it. Now, R3 is one of these consortia that is trying to revolutionize banking with the blockchain. And they got in bed 2 years or maybe a year ago with another company called Ripple. Ripple is much more of a conventional cryptocurrency system, but it's a centralized one. So it operates like a central bank in its own tokens. So it issues Ripple tokens, it holds some of them back, and it can regulate the price a little bit because essentially it's got a reserve of Ripple and only it can determine what's free float and what isn't. And over the last year, well, since January, Ripple tokens have absolutely skyrocketed. And it turns out, about a year ago, Ripple did a deal with R3 where they wanted access to the banking network because they desperately wanted in to the formal system. And they said to R3, if you give us access to your banking clients, we'll pay you for this with options on our own currency. And R3 went, sure, why not? And a year down the line, the proof of concept that they promised never delivered. R3 was not very happy about it, whatever. But turns out Ripple made a contract for these options. Those options are coming into expiry now. And R3, even though, well, R3 is of the opinion that they were not delivered the proof of concept that they were promised. And so they're now suing Ripple for the underlying options. And Ripple are going, hang on a minute, where's the contract? There is no contract. It was just a word of mouth agreement. We didn't agree to anything because they control their own units. Now, I find this fabulously ironic for any system that is trying to suggest that it can revolutionize the banking system through immutable ledgers where you'll never have to question contract law ever again. The two biggest frontrunners in this space can't agree whether or not they agreed a contract over some options. I mean, that this is happening in the public arena more than anything, I think epitomizes the kind of farcical nature of the whole thing. So my whole point is that really these people are utopians. They think they've created a system that can operate without credit. But as time has gone on, they've realized the limitations. They've realized they need to create scale, and they've realized that maybe human nature is a bit more of a problem than they imagined. And that when it comes to legal contracts, whether you have a blockchain system or not, you can still be screwed over, effectively. That's what I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So I feel maybe my kind of two one-liners, considering I'm on a panel with very clear, concise speakers and thinkers. The first is you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And the other is if you don't know where you're going, you're going to end up somewhere else. And I think that a lot of the story that we're hearing today is that people have unfortunately lived long enough that the heroic stories they told themselves about what they were doing have started to descend into villainy, and also that they didn't really have a clear idea of where they're going, and lo and behold, they're starting to end up somewhere else. So I am a lawyer and not interested in interpreting the world as much as changing it. And we have an idea of where we want to go, and it's a world where there's economic justice and there are civil rights and human freedom. The question then becomes, how does that fit at the intersection of law, money and finance and technology, which is where this conversation is being taken place. So in addition to running the Modern Money Network, which is an attempt to bring together lawyers and economists to develop a new kind of legal economic framework to address some of the institutional and social questions facing the world, I also consult with a company called eCurrency Mint, who is a technology company providing a central bank digital cash instrument. I'll explain what that is They've been working with about 20, 25 central banks around the world. They launched in Senegal last year, and they're launching in a number of other countries as well. I also work with a group of technologists who are working on a project called the Freedom Box, which is an attempt to create a small, secure private server that can do the basic kinds of communication and basic services that individuals need without requiring your data and or a platform managed by some other intermediary. So I sit at the intersection of those different projects, as well as being a PhD student at Cornell Law School, in an attempt to try and get an understanding of how these different perspectives need to go together. Because my view, and I think you can see on this panel, you can't really understand these issues solely as an economist or solely as a technologist or solely as a lawyer. They need to be looked at least through those three lenses, as well as, of course, broader social science perspectives. So what is cryptocurrency? I think the first step is to work out what it isn't. And as I think we've heard, it's not going to be the kind of libertarian fantasy world that some people have hoped it would be. And one reason for that, which Izzy mentioned right at the end of her talk, leading perfectly into mine, is that they're not really interested in challenging the underlying legal institutions of capitalism. You cannot have a cryptocurrency system without first having a legal system of property claims that can be disputed. If you don't own anything, what's the point of trading anything? And similarly, if you can't have contracts that you can fall back on, even if the contract is there is no contract, then there isn't any point of developing anything that you want to invest time and energy in that could be taken away from you the minute you're not looking at it or holding a gun right outside the door of. So if the idea that this was ever going to disrupt the fundamental institutions of capitalism was always a myth, because it was never trying to do so. At the same time, there is this idea that the technology is different from the money claims that were being made about the technology. So I think that there are a lot of reasons to be interested in blockchain and distributed ledger technology on a range of different levels as an asset trading platform. And as a lawyer, I'm interested in what it's going to do epistemologically to the rules of evidence and what it means to own something and when we determine ownership and things like even identity, whether it, things that used to be perhaps a binary around a certain lever or a certain condition now may be going to turn closer to some sort of statistical average or sort of a range of different claims that will then be weighed according to some sort of distributed process. But those things aren't what cryptocurrency is about. Cryptocurrency is about currency, which, as Perry says, means you need a theory of money. And there are different aspects to what makes something money. One is there is a money thing, whether that's tangible or not, whether that's simply a credit liability or a credit record on some accounting entry. There's also the underlying infrastructure, the market infrastructure under which those money things operate, whether that's a credit system or some sort of fiat currency system or some sort of attempt at a commodity-based system. And what I think we're seeing with the issue of scale that Izzy is talking about is a line that Hyman Minsky used to say, anyone can create money, the challenge is to get it accepted. Once upon a time, even though anyone could create money, a printing press was quite expensive, a bureau of engraving and printing was quite expensive, a mint was quite expensive. Now, that's simply a matter of downloading a software app on your phone. So everyone is creating money, and the challenge is what's going to be accepted and why. But what I'm interested in at probably the most fundamental layer is what this does to the social and imaginative discourse around money. Because as we were just joking before this panel started, you can have conversations that people wouldn't normally be willing to have if you add the word tech in front of it. So whether these are new questions that we're dealing with or simply very old questions that suddenly a lot of people are starting to pay attention to is sort of where I think a lot of this conversation needs to start going, because there were periods in history, even quite recent history in the 19th century, when monetary issues were on the forefront of newspapers and on people's minds. People who were business people had to understand monetary theories and the debates thereof, because if they didn't, someone would eat their lunch and they'd lose their business. And for a period, maybe it seemed like those questions had been solved, or they were questions really to be dealt with by a small group of experts behind a set of closed doors. But as the most recent Pete Peterson conference on rethinking macroeconomics maybe made clear, or even the recent Jackson Hole conferences, the people who told us that they had a very clear idea of what was going on and how everything worked don't and didn't. And so these questions are sort of being thrown back to the rest of us to start thinking about. And it's a messy and scary process to be asked to think about very complicated questions that you thought someone smarter than you had already answered. And people are going to get a lot of things wrong before they get it right. But I think in that respect, the fact that this is a conversation that people on the street and people reading the average newspaper are starting to think about is a welcome development for the popularization of important social issues around key social and political infrastructure. So why do I think it's significant? The first is it changes the terrain of old fights by revealing underlying values more clearly. So as Perry said, there are long-standing debates in economics around monetarism versus a sort of creditary nature of money. And those debates sort of simmer and people write arguments, different papers arguing it, and occasionally a crazy president will nominate somebody as the Federal Reserve Chairman or something who maybe has really weird views relative to other people. But normally these debates haven't needed to be solved necessarily, whereas one of the things that this technology does is forces resolution to issues that may not have necessarily required an absolute resolution in the past. The second thing is it changes the balance of power between different entities or stakeholders in this process. So what you're seeing is not just the rise of coders as a new sort of expertise power base in this conversation. They've invited themselves to a table that might have previously been reserved to policymakers, bankers, and lawyers. But also an industrial shift. I work with mobile money operators in developing countries and central banks in those spaces, and it's the telecom companies that are really interested in a lot of this technology, even as they don't want to become banks at all. They want to become payments processors, but that line is not a very clear line. So you're seeing two industries, very, very large, very powerful industries, very global industries, starting to step on each other's toes in a way that historically wasn't necessarily always the case. And in doing so, one of the things that's of interest is that it's revealing commonalities between different kinds of social infrastructure that may have seemed to be different. So once upon a time in the mid-90s, if you were wanting to communicate with somebody, you might send a text message over the SMS system, or you might call somebody on a landline, or maybe you would log on to the internet and try and send an email. And those would be very different things. They would have different logics, they'd have different legal regimes, they would have different power structures and industrial structures. Today, those industries are largely the same industry. It's a data network sending data packets. Now, that industry doesn't have an inherent theory of money or what goes in those data packets, and that's where a lot of the economics and the financial issues start to come in. But at a point at which certain kinds of infrastructure that seem to serve different social functions, as it becomes more sophisticated, gloms together, means that we're starting to see a realignment of different power bases, and that in that realignment there is space to move things and make change. So what I'm interested in mostly is the public side of things, and by that I don't simply mean the state, I mean the interests of the public, that is to say your interests as a citizen, as a person with liberties that are independent of your role as a market actor, even if your ability to participate in a market as a market actor may be considered to be a public and social functional right. So first of all, I think that what the cryptocurrency debates are starting to do is force people to look at what are critical public infrastructure services when it comes to payments and money. So we're starting to see central banks and even the Bank of International Settlements last month talking about the idea of giving individuals retail accounts at a central bank. Now, Ecuador did this a few years ago to absolutely no fanfare outside of, I'm sure, some people who follow these things relatively closely. But that's a huge shift to the way that we see a public provisioning of infrastructure. Now, some countries like the UK have postal banking systems that arguably do a similar role, but the idea that we may be rendering obsolete the need for a set of payments processes that historically were doing things that a central bank didn't have the infrastructure to do. You couldn't have we didn't have a local central bank branch in every town to manage the paper processing, but now you don't need that. You just need a cell phone tower to central command to do that kind of processing. But in addition to those retail central banking accounts, you're also seeing this idea, and my advisors at Cornell Law School, Robert Hockett and Sally Omarova, just wrote a great piece called The Finance Franchise, building on the hierarchy of money concept and the notion that these different layers of the hierarchy are connected. And one of the points they make is that when the banking system is ultimately backed by the central bank, and the central bank is backed by the full faith and credit of the government or the set of governments in the European Union that underlie that central bank, then the banking extension of credit is not so dissimilar from the extension of money itself. Government money, that is to say. So the question then becomes, at what point do we call this a public service? At what point do we acknowledge that what they're essentially doing is extending public money? And if that's the case, at what point do we want to be limiting deposit insurance and limiting liquidity provisioning in such a way that may cause systemic fragility and risk when it doesn't actually result in any kind of prevention of moral hazard, as is the original claim underlying those limits in the first place in a different interest rate targeting regime? So you've got this central banking infrastructure layer. On the other hand, this is the area where it comes down to individual citizens, it's the issue of privacy. Now, economists, don't necessarily always naturally go to questions of civil liberties and civil rights, but the internet is a fundamental change in social structure relative to prior epochs, in the sense that we are building a central nervous system around the entire planet where people can speak and communicate to each other in ways that they were not able to do in prior regimes. So in a prior regime, your identity was formed primarily about in relation to the people you grew up in geographic proximity to. And jurisdictions, legal and political, evolved in response to the fact that that was where affinity networks were the strongest. What you're seeing today is the development and introduction of new kinds of affinity networks that are not necessarily geographically based, while at the same time legal and financial infrastructure remains inherently jurisdictionally based. So as Mervyn King said, banks are global in life, but they're national in death. And so is the case with cryptocurrency and the regulation thereof. But the question then is, what happens if we build a central nervous system where surveillance and control are baked in? So I think that while the cryptocurrency people, as Perry was saying, have a fear of centralized authority, some of them aren't willing to give up on the centralized authority that keeps their property rights intact, and that's a problem. But the deeper question isn't whether they can engage in transaction processing without a centralized authority approving that. It's whether they can engage in any form of activity without requiring permission. And in that respect, you don't necessarily need to have the government completely removed from the system. You need to have the ability to transact and engage in economic activity without the government approving each individual action. So cash, as a form of technology, has regulatory limits. There are barcodes on it. You theoretically can't take more than $10,000 over a state border in the United States without declaring it. But the technology itself doesn't discriminate whether you want to use that to buy a soda or to buy cocaine or to snort cocaine. What it's really about is that the technology has trust embedded in the instrument, but once the instrument is out there, it has a degree of privacy and autonomy in the individual transaction. So when we're thinking about what the limits of central bank issued accounts versus a private Bitcoin instrument that may be only useful for a kind of money laundering stage only to then be converted back into a more stable currency, or a sort of digital central bank or government issued cash instrument, what we need to be thinking about is not just, is this convenient for my transaction? Does this allow me to do something without getting approval about the transaction? We need to think about human privacy and freedom. What does it mean to be able to engage in social life without needing the approval of the Communist Party of China or Mubarak or President Trump? So the issue that we are starting to see come out with these cryptocurrencies debates is a broader question of the sort of balance between freedom and security that in the past hasn't had a clear answer, but this technology is forcing an answer. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Yeah. So now we're supposed to react to each other just a little bit as a way of then opening it up. There's so many things to react to, but I will select. Okay. I think maybe the main point, picking up from one of the main points that Ron made, is to appreciate that distributed ledger technology is new and disruptive. Okay, that exactly how that's going to be used, okay, is in play. Okay, I agree with that. Okay, idea of the cryptos is, in terms of their notion of where they want to go, is like the Chicago plan, if you remember, 100% money, okay, where there's no credit at all, no business credit, no household credit, no nothing. The Chicago plan was based around the idea that there would only be money and equity. Money was issued by the state, by the government. So, and that was it. So cryptos agree with all that except the state part, okay? And the money is issued by the miners, okay? So that's the difference. We didn't get that world. Okay, remember when Henry Simons was writing about that, it was in the depths of the Great Depression, right? When the banks had collapsed and the notion that maybe the international monetary system had collapsed, and there was like, how, credit is so unstable, let's build a world without credit, okay? And so I think that's one end of the spectrum, okay? On the other end of the spectrum, Rohan mentioned the latest report in the BIS about central bank cryptocurrencies. Okay, he was referring to this as people having accounts at the central bank. In a certain way, people already have accounts at the central bank. That's what those green pieces of paper are. Okay, are just accounts that move around anonymously. You don't have to tell the central bank that you've switched your account to somebody else, but that's sort of what they are, and that's what banknotes were also. They were just substitutes for deposits. They were deposits that were pay-to-bearer kind of deposits. So we're reinventing some form, and in fact, the Bank of England always had private accounts at the Bank of England, so it was a bank actually, and you could have had an account there. I think it's still true that you could. So this is not particularly, you're again reinventing some of these things, but I want to use this moment to really draw attention to what Rohan was saying. Central banks are grabbing onto this technology themselves, okay, and they run the payment system. So and they are very concerned about things like, if you've ever tried to wire money from one country to another, it is it's expensive, it's slow, it's ridiculous, okay? And they feel that blockchain is challenging them, but Bitcoin is challenging them. People are using this technology for capital flight out of China, for moving money around countries, and they don't like that. Okay, the central banks feel like that's their business, and if they don't want to create economic incentive for people to use that wire service instead of their own FedWire and chips and so forth, so they're going to grab onto blockchain and make it much cheaper to wire money from one country to another, and that's a good thing. Actually, I would be pleased about that. That would help my life a little bit. Well, the last thing I'll say is observe. So it's not just that the central banks are now getting, when Ben Bernanke first mentioned that he was going to be interested in cryptocurrencies, people were freaked out about that, right? They didn't understand what he was saying. He was saying, cryptocurrency, c'est moi. This is not that I'm interested in Bitcoin. No. I'm interested in using this technology here at the central bank, okay, where the proof of work analogy is the thing that we control, and not you, which is the way it is now. Note very importantly so it's not just that the central banks have decided they want to go into the cryptocurrency business. Okay. I think they've also decided that they want to crush the existing cryptocurrency world. Okay, so the closing of the exchanges in China, in South Korea, you watch. Okay. Things are moving pretty rapidly. A lot of the proliferation of intermediaries is about trying to create this credit element, I think, so that the people who have long positions in Bitcoin can sell it to the suckers, okay, before the end is here, okay? This is what it looks like at the end of a boom. I come back to my first point because I don't want to get too much into that, which is the point about distributed ledger technology. We're at a moment in history very similar in my mind to what happened when the quant revolution happened in finance. There was all this smoky room and the way trading happened, and suddenly computers came in and all these quants came in and they all had physics PhDs. Now it's happening in money. It happened in finance basically 40, 50 years ago. Okay, that's the story I tell in my second book about Fisher Black, who was the way the quant revolution came to Goldman Sachs. Okay, there will be a story about the way the distributed ledger, okay, technology came to Goldman Sachs. That's happening right now. We don't know who it is that's the Fisher Black analog, but I bet you they're employed.
So I'm going to dissent a little bit for the first time ever. So I'm more of a skeptic about distributed ledger technology, mainly because there seems to me to be a paradox between especially in the central bank use case, because it seems to me there's a paradox with a central bank distributing its ledgers. And what are we really talking about here? It's about how you distribute your information about who owns what. But if you're the central bank, who are going to be the nodes that you trust to hold that?
Other central banks, tiny club.
Tiny club, right? But then it's not really a distribution. It's more of a backup system, which we have already. The fact that central banks can share information between them, we kind of have that with BIS. So I'm not convinced that's what we're really talking about there is everyone being plugged into the same system. Do you need to share all the data ad nauseum? You don't, because every time you replicate this data, it's a cost. This is what Bitcoin is learning, is that distribution of data is really, really expensive. Yes, there's Moore's law and costs of data processing are going down all the time, but the distribution is going so much more quickly that it's when you speak to proper technologists, they just say, there is no doubt a centralized database is always going to be more efficient. It is just the only reason you distribute the data is for backup reasons. There's also unintended consequences, such as you're only as strong as the weakest member in your group. So for a distributed ledger to really work, you all have to be on the same sort of business logic. If you operate a network of ledgers where some people originate money with absolutely zero credit requirements, and then the other people are very, very prudent, well, who's going to be introducing risk into your network? It's the guy with the lowest standards. So unless you share the same business logic, there's really no point. I mean, we're really talking about shared balance sheets. A database is a euphemism in this case for a balance sheet. And then the other point I would say is, if you do get a world where everyone has the same business, every bank or financial entity has the same business logic, you're all sharing the same data, are you basically one company? Because I think you are. You're essentially just branches of the same company. There's no diversity. There's no different view on finance, and that kind of reminds me as a Pole. It's Polish person. This is Gosbanki. It takes us into a world of and then the same applies to central banks opening their balance sheets to everybody. This is Gosbank territory. There is no competition from the private sector, and I appreciate the financial franchise theory. There is an element of public duty already going on. The banks are quasi-agents of the public body already, but I'm not sure. What I did want to say, just adding to what Perry was saying and what Rohan was saying, is liquidity is really important in this area, and it's one of the things that is most overlooked. There is a perception that you can assure liquidity now if you link these tokens to assets. So we're now going through a phenomenon called tokenization, where, as far as I can see, it's the reinvention of securitization, with the simple concept that if a token is now asset-based, it will hold its value better, and through essentially being distributed, chopped and diced across many different shapes and forms, and distributed to lots of small investors, liquidity will be assured. So this is fascinating to me because, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it, because I do think that's the next step. When cryptocurrency becomes the new form of securitization, and it becomes asset-backed, and it believes in its own liquidity creation, that's where the cookie will crumble, because reality will catch up with it when those assets can't budge.
Yeah, so the first thing, in regards to what Perry was saying about central banks getting in on the game, I mean, Felix Salmon wrote a great piece about 4 years ago sort of saying, why the hell is the Fed so behind on taking responsibility for payments infrastructure renewal? And I think one of the answers is, A, they didn't think that they were capable, and B, they didn't want to try to have that fight with entities that were running those things at that time, namely the depository banking system, running the retail payments rails. But of course now that they've been forced into that. And if you look at the rhetoric of central banks towards cryptocurrencies and things, even 4 years ago, it was, this is interesting but a long way off. And then it was, oh, this is interesting and happening in the private markets, we should keep an eye on it. Then it's, this is probably coming, there'll probably be central bank stuff, but not anytime soon. And then it's, this is happening right now, we better get on this. And that's a rhetorical shift that you can see in live time in the space of a few years. I think one thing that is important to note there is that, and JP Koenig, who writes a great blog called Moneyness, has been good on this. There are structural legal reasons, not technical or engineering reasons, but legal reasons why instantaneous settlement of every form of transaction is not always a good thing. There is a reason why for payment systems that had the capacity to go to T+0 or T+1 stayed at T+3 over a period of time, not just for batching and netting purposes, which, as Perry has pointed out, is very valuable and saves a lot of time when you're dealing with large gross flows, but also for legal reasons that come with the ability to sort of charge back and to dispute settlements and things that would be undermined or potentially need to be rethought in a world where all transactions happen instantaneously. And you see this at the structural level with capital flight. When hot money flies out of somewhere, you go, wait a second, maybe we should be slowing these systems down a little bit. The same logic applies down to individual payments level. And similarly, when it comes to crushing others, there's a reason why the Secret Service's two jobs are to protect the president, protect the value of the currency in the United States. This is a core political value of sovereignty, that the ability to maintain control over your own currency. And even as Minsky says, we can all create our own monies. At the point at which those become structurally threatening to the sovereign, you're going to start to see a form of realpolitik emerge that's different from the kind of economics language that you may see in regular finance discourse. In regards to this question, distributed ledger, that Izzy was talking about, I mean, I agree that there is a lot of this question of where the differentiation lies, or where decentralization is important. First of all, we do have prudential regulatory standards, and so we are trying to have a level of harmonization. And then the question is, what is the difference between these banks if they're really supposed to be doing the same sort of credit analysis? And you see these kinds of tensions with the Basel II and the Basel III accords and the sort of logic that underlie them. I think, to sort of elaborate what I said in my talk briefly, the real interesting transformational potential of distributed ledger and blockchain technology is not in finance. It's in boring legal issues like property title registries and maybe evidence law. How many people here got into this world because they're interested in evidence law? Not many, right? It's not really the reason why this conversation is coming up, because people who are dealing with selling land in rural England are suddenly really excited that this is going to take like a fifth of the energy and processing costs. That's not the kind of sexy reason why you're seeing huge smart money around the world try to get involved. Even though, as crises like the MERS property rights system in the US showed, often these boring property legal regimes are actually incredibly structurally important to how the financial system works. So on that, I mean, I think, yes, this shift from a contractual basis of money to a property basis of money in a sort of, which is a different legal regime, even though it can achieve the same effects. Annalise Riles, a law professor at Cornell, has done great work looking at how collateralization of property assets is the sort of secret blood, legal blood of contemporary finance. And I think that you're seeing that with these coins. You're sort of creating almost digital intellectual property assets and then working out how to collateralize them, so suddenly you've got an infinite source of finance. You don't even need the pretense there's a house or a mortgage underneath now to create 6 levels of securitized assets on top. And more importantly, perhaps even, you can't collateralize and hypothecate cash in a way that you can do with treasury securities. So it's relevant even at the level of public money, the legal design of what you're talking about. So that's the last thing I want to mention, is that I think the convertibility of different forms of private assets into public assets, on one level, there is a problem with trying to say everything is public. You do have the Gosbank question, although we have a judicial system that's usually pretty centralized, so maybe there are certain kinds of core public services where we need to deal with the fact that it's an inherent natural monopoly and go from there. And I think that's the kind of point of the finance franchise, that there is an aspect of the full faith and credit of the government that underlies the banking system, at the very least, if not even the shadow banking system, that should be acknowledged in this design and not just sort of wished away. If it is centralized, it is centralized, and that's where we need to start from. But what the crypto story does is allows us to look at the meta layer of these issues. If convertibility along the money hierarchy at par is what really defines these relationships between the central bank and the banks and the shadow banks between their different kinds of assets, the line that I use with regards to central bank issued cryptocurrency is super convertibility, because what you have finally is an ability to say there's an instrument that has some sort of property. Maybe it's cash in hand, maybe it's a bearer instrument, maybe it's an account-based instrument, maybe it earns interest, maybe it doesn't, maybe it has maturity, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's collateralizable, maybe it's not, but there's this underlyingness that makes it a government-issued liability, and from that we can start to develop a more clear taxonomy of the different kinds of features of financial instruments and why and where they may be useful. So I think it's the realignment of the conceptual framework has value in and of itself, even if the solutions that are being proposed by these adherents aren't the right ones.
Thank you. Thank you for your speakers. We're going to open the floor. So, please.
Okay, thanks.
I
Now what I learned from this,
a couple of comments and
Please,
questions.
you can-
Yeah, and then yeah.
So,
shall I?
Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
good. What I learned from the discussion is that bitcoins, cryptocurrencies are difficult if I want to settle something between you and me. But I have no idea where this question is leading. Could bitcoins be useful higher up in the hierarchy? I mean, there are countries who are in constant fear that they are cut off from the international payment system, Russia, China. Would cryptocurrencies be a useful basis for them to establish an alternative to the international dollar? Does that make sense at all?
Okay, so my name is Tuna Nils. Thank you for bringing this thing up about central banks going into cryptocurrency. And Perry, you said that we already have this thing. We already have sort of an account at the central bank. We have notes and coins. But I can't pay taxes in notes and coins. I can't get my wages paid in notes and coins. And in my country, at least, Scandinavia in general, we're moving quickly towards cashless society. So wouldn't it be interesting to look at actually having an account at the central bank where you're actually able to do this, perform the same things that you are capable of doing with banks?
Yeah, thank you. Same question about if we move in that direction where the central banks have they use blockchain technology, and you can have an account directly with the central bank, and then as you were talking about, then suddenly we have central banks that know a lot. Like you have China, you have Trump or something, have this information about it, and we could move in that direction. Wouldn't then different cryptocurrencies exactly be this? And then it's like you're saying, less and less cash available, maybe not gone, but less. You won't be able to use it as much, maybe. And then cryptocurrencies will become for those who I guess it's about fear that some people actually don't want the state to see what you're doing, and some people want to run away. And then sometimes the states collapse. Like you look at Venezuela, like they're going over to more cryptocurrencies, using them when the state collapses. So it still becomes this important part of the future of money. And maybe exactly as more having the exchange value when that is needed, when you need some way of exchanging that when you don't want to be go somewhere else for credit, you go somewhere else for the security, but sometimes you just need the exchange to not be a part of this nationalized system.
Thank you for a great panel. I thought it was very informative. I was just wondering, so increasingly there's increasingly talk of like trying to, as you were talking about, sort of extracting their like technology and using it for blockchain. And I've heard a lot about stuff about smart contracts, and I'm not entirely sure what that means, because it's sort of like banks are trying to adopt this for like a distributed ledger technology to sort of talk about smart contracts, and I'm not entirely sure what that means. So if anybody in the panel knows, I would love to hear about that. And also, I think since we're talking about how this is sort of fundamentally, as Perry was talking about, how it's fundamentally like going to lead to a search for sort of what is the theory behind it, and what's the theory, or what is the economics behind sort of what is happening and what can happen in the future. And since it's coming back down to like sort of democratizing the libertarian ideal here is sort of democratizing money. I think again, I guess we can talk endlessly about ironies, is that isn't it making like increasingly
more opaque to even understand what's happening. And insofar as like when say credit systems actually adopt this technology, the financial system as we have right now is so unbelievably opaque to people who don't have a PhD or like aren't journalists or studying this forever. Isn't it like if you could comment on the implications for like normal people to just understand what's happening in the financial system, I would really appreciate it. Thanks.
So I'd love to take the Venezuela point and the smart contract point. So very simply speaking, I find it very strange that there's this perception now that we can suddenly we have the capacity to make digital currencies because of the blockchain. We've had the capacity to make digital currencies for ages, okay? It's not, digital currencies have been around, like my NatWest deposits are basically a digital currency, right? They are digital, don't need the blockchain, have never depended on the blockchain. For a central bank to issue a digital currency, it does not need a blockchain. It just needs to open its balance sheet to every single person, right? The reason it doesn't do that is because there's a cost to processing. Processing is not cheap. And actually, the minting and creating of coinage is also not cheap. I think it's Jeffrey Lacker who has done good stuff on the cost of I think it's him, Lacker, who has many economic papers about the real cost of providing this public utility that is cash, right? So the question is, what is more efficient, cash or electronic payment? We can do electronic payments for everybody, but there are inherent downsides to it as well as upsides. So as Perry mentioned, cash has this beautiful function of privacy, and it's natural, it's organic. We issue X amount of cash into the system, and then the government, it's kind of backed by the government, but the government can't really detect where it's going, so it has this double feature. If everything's electronic, then theoretically, you could encrypt it, but then it defies the logic of having a central bank currency. Why not then allow the banking network, which has been issuing digital currency as a sort of agent of the central bank for generations, to do that job as it is already doing? Regarding Venezuela, I also feel there's a lot of confused logic. It's like there's this assumption that if we build the currency, all the social problems of these countries will go away. And it's like, actually it's the opposite. The currency is a reflection of the underlying economies that back these currencies. So just giving the currency to Venezuela is not going to solve its problems. Venezuela's problems are related to the fact that it's had massive underinvestment in most of its infrastructure. It's an oil exporter that it depends on imports of product because it has no refineries. So even though it has cheap energy, there is a massive cost for its acquiring Bitcoin. So theoretically, all these people moving to Bitcoin in Venezuela, well, what's really happening here? They have to give up real economic value, which is their bolivars, for a stake in Bitcoin, or they have to mine it with energy that could be otherwise going towards making toilet roll, right? So where is the logic? The only incentive is for a few sort of elite Venezuelans to give up the value they have to hold a better store of value, on the presumption that Bitcoin is going to continue going up, whereas the bolivar is going to continue going down. How that improves the economics or the medium of exchange functionality in the country is beyond me. It doesn't. If anything, it creates a Gresham's law type effect. So yes, Russia could use Bitcoin, but that doesn't solve the problem of its own economy, or the fact that the geopolitical situation that it finds itself. These are just plasters. As to the smart contract thing, you're right. The opacity in the system and the opaque sort of institutions that are being built up, and the jargon is unbelievable. I mean, banking has always been about jargon, and now you've brought in tech people who have their own jargon. So I've spent all my life learning bank jargon, and now I have to learn tech jargon on top of it. It's like unbelievable. And fundamentally, smart contracts, again, you don't need a blockchain to do a smart contract. Smart contracts have been around for ages. Your direct debit is a smart contract, okay? So this idea that you have to have a blockchain or distributed ledger to make a smart contract is completely wrong. In fact, I argue in my writing that distributed ledgers have a perverse effect on all this stuff because they limit accountability. Because if you share the accountability for a contract between in a system where effectively you don't have to worry because the system does the processing and no one has to, the contract will write itself and it will execute itself, and if anything goes wrong, there'll be some sort of judicial process that decides who gets what without, no one has to watch it, nobody has to care, and then before you know it, the whole system collapses because no one's paying attention to anything, right? So there's a sort of tragedy of the commons effect. And smart contracts, I just don't think you can take out with the Ripple R3 example, just because you've processed the contract in a digital format, doesn't mean that you can foresee force majeure or disputes. It's an improbability. The cost of the legal system, the cost of banking, the cost of international transactions and cross-border transactions is the stuff on the fringes that goes wrong, and that's always going to be the case because basically none of us can agree on anything, as Brexit shows.
Yeah.
So those are my points.
Building on this question about contract law, one of the first things that you learn, and Holmes and other lawyers made this point a long time ago, when you make a promise to do something in a contract, you're making a promise to pay damages in the event you don't do it. So that's the first thing. You're not saying this is actually going to happen. You're hedging and essentially creating an option. But more than that, the idea that a contract has got all the information in it that needs to be resolved in the event of a contractual dispute is also just simply not true. In the same way as people learn that property rights aren't a relationship of you to your thing, it's a relationship of you to other people with relationship to that thing. And the first thing that happens when you take Contract Law 101 is you go in and they tell you all the ways in which these contracts got reinterpreted by the court in live time in response to not just the conditions of that relationship, but the changing conditions of society. If the industry or the way that society is right now isn't conducive to that contract being interpreted the way that both parties would like it interpreted, the court's going to step in and interpret it differently. So there's always a third party, even in what seem to be bilateral contracts. In terms of the issue of privacy, this is the last generation that has people who are born outside of the internet. The next generation is not going to know that they're living in a surveilled world. They're just going to feel a little bit less safe and a little bit less comfortable speaking out. So we have a chance to do something about this. And the work that I do with this company, eCurrency Mint, their technology isn't a centralized ledger system. It's what I call an invisible ledger system, in the same way as cash is invisible. They keep a record of the amount of units outstanding, but the wallet network, which can be run by intermediaries and things, does the transaction processing independent of that final intermediary. And I'm not enough of a tech expert to make sure that they don't have a backdoor, the NSA hasn't infiltrated and hold one of them hostage, but they're at least letting me make this case publicly that this is what's important, so that I'm telling you this is what's important. And if you do know coders, or if you're going to work with coders as economists and financiers, make sure that this is the kind of central bank technology we're creating.
But doesn't that sound a lot, sorry to interrupt, but doesn't that sound a lot like the conventional banking system? So you've got your main issuer of the currency, which tracks how many units there are, but the actual processing is done in a fragmented way by private competitive entities who are effectively banks, not wallets.
Yes, although to the extent that this isn't doing credit extension but simple lifetime processing, and there may be limits on the quantity of that, you could run your own wallet. So this is a situation where we can, to sort of take Kaminska's idea, we can be our own bank. And the example here is a federated structure like email, right? Most people might put their email with Gmail or with Hotmail or something, and you can be damn sure Gmail's reading what's going on in your email, right? But if you do have a sense of privacy and want to create your own server, maybe not before you run for president, but you can do so in a way that allows you to run your own server, keep your own emails private to yourself, but still talk to the email network, because it's a common underlying protocol, and that protocol preserves the integrity of the data, so that as long as the underlying theory of the government money that's backing that digital wallet network has integrity, you can have a system where those transactions get processed without. Now,
I sorry to interrupt, but I looked into this because I really wanted a private email network, and the cost of setting up your own server and the user sort of knowledge that would be needed is beyond
So let me introduce you to a company called Freedom Box. It's a non-profit foundation that's doing this work to turn a turnkey, user-accessible server it's run on free software. You buy a $10 computer, you plug it in the wall, and you simply press on.
Okay,
that's their mission statement, because of that exact problem. And there is a community of coders and programmers who believe in political freedom. The free software movement is where it started, but they have analogs in free culture, and they work with open source hardware, box makers and things. This is the next frontier of that fight, because as long as you say, only people who are computer coders know how to set up their own email servers, the rest of us don't have freedom. The last thing I just want to say is about state breakdowns. I completely agree with what Izzy was saying. It's about the underlying state, of course. The CIA and the other kinds of pressure that are being put on Venezuela doesn't hurt either. But we can take the lessons that we apply to these cryptocurrency conversations, even if it's the central bank that's going to be the dominant one, and apply them down at the local level. There are limits to that, but my organization, Modern Money Network, works with these MMT economists who talk about one of the ways that money can have value is because it's receivable in payment of taxes. And you can have local taxes. You can have local access to resources that require some payment. The New York City subway system is a tax, right? You could be issuing and paying a certain number of employees, maybe not every employee, but a certain number of employees in New York City with New York City subway tokens, and that would be a way to generate more liquidity and growth in New York City without having to have access to the central bank's currency system, as long as everybody else in the whole world knew that they're going to continue to use the New York subway at some point in the future. And you see that at the complementary currency movement. I don't think that's going to replace government currencies any more than I think Bitcoin's going to replace government currencies. But you see in places like sub-Saharan Africa, people like Will Ruddick in the creation of the Bangla Pesa, where that technology is creating local community liquidity and teaching people about how money works. And to the extent that it's nice to have a bit more, commerce going on in these places where people would like to do work but just can't essentially settle their credits and debts with each other without some common underlying unit of account and sufficiently liquid medium of final settlement, local final settlement. You can also teach them that this is always going to be insufficient until we take this fight up to the political authority that has the final settlement in that space, so that the local proof of concept or even the proof of non-concept can be a catalyst to larger political and social mobilization.
It's interesting to me that in the reaction to these questions, it was the smart contracts question that got most of the emotion. Let me just put that aside for a moment, and I'm going to come back to that and observe that the first three questions, are engaging with other dimensions of the system that I think we also need to be alert to. The questioners may not have realized that, but they're coming from concern about two features of the system that I always emphasize in my teaching. The first one is essential hybridity. That this is a system that is both public and private, and the public part, the way economists understand the public part is that it's just sort of making up for market failure or something like that, or pagoo taxes for externalities or something. That's just not helpful, in understanding the monetary system. These are intertwined. The institutions are just intertwined, and they're evolving together. They're co-evolving. They maybe were not always so. There were, this is a historical argument, and you can look at this, but in modern times they are. And these disruptive new technologies are asking at every single margin along that intertwining, where do we redraw the boundary? How do we redo the negotiation? This is negotiation, about these boundaries, and you're hearing it, and you hear extreme versions of these negotiations that are always there, which is, everything the private sector does is illegitimate, only the state, or everything that the state does is illegitimate, and none of, it's really, those are negotiating positions, but they're not where you're going to wind up, You're going to wind up somewhere enmeshed. That sort of refers to the question about Venezuela, the question about cashless society. The second dimension of the system that I would emphasize that hasn't been brought out here is its hierarchical character. Rohan mentioned sort of natural monopoly. I don't really even think of it so much as a natural monopoly, but that came up in the question about will the dollar is the world reserve currency, but what about countries that are kind of where the power of the dollar is being used to exclude them for geopolitical reasons or for whatever. Look, countries can trade in whatever. These are bilateral credit contracts. You can settle your contracts any way you want. The question is, if 90% of the world is dollar world, and you're excluded from that, that's bad news. That's not so good. And the fact that the U.S. also seems to be tracking back. It's not just that you you're not allowed to use SWIFT, but nobody you trade with is allowed to use SWIFT. I think it's actually bad. If I were a central bank governor, I would oppose the State Department trying to use the global payment system as a tool of geopolitical influence. I think this this is not wise, okay? And you're going to reap a whirlwind, okay? Because it leads to financial innovation, okay? That you're not going to be able to control. But now let me talk about smart contracts. In this workshop that there was all lawyers, so they were really interested in smart contracts, and the technologists responded. What they're worried about with smart contracts is performance. Okay, you say in this contract that you're going to do something. Okay, we want to just make sure that you do it. Okay, and the instinctive reaction of the technologists is, how do we do this? Okay, we put aside assets, all that, to make sure that they're there. They're already there. They're out of your control, so that the contract just sucks from this pile of assets whenever you're supposed to make a payment. But what is that? That's the elimination of credit. That's making it all equity. It's like, here's a big pile of value. Okay, I'm borrowing, and the way I'm going to make sure that I pay back is I'm going to take every single cent that I borrowed and put it over here in a pile so that you can pull it all back. Well, that's not borrowing, and so it's fear of credit, okay, that is driving the smart contract movement also. And when you really peel it away, okay, and I think it's that fear is more general, I guess I want to say. Okay, so instead of saying they're just silly, these technologists, they don't understand how credit works, I just want to now make a link. Notice what we did in financial re-regulation after the financial crisis, right? The authorities, okay, not me, the actual authorities in the whole world said, unsecured credit is the problem, okay? The Fed funds market, which is banks borrowing and lending to each other without collateral, okay? The Eurodollar market, okay, outside the U.S., banks borrow, the interbank market, banks borrowing without, let's kill that. Let's make, which they did, basically, with regulation. And it's been replaced by secured borrowing of two important sorts. One is the repo market, where you're repurchase agreement, where you're using collateral and you're borrowing against collateral. And if you have assets, and so there's a shortage of collateral now that's pushing around prices in very weird ways. Okay, and the second thing that happened was foreign exchange swaps. Okay, which are basically exchange of currencies and promise to exchange them back. So secured borrowing is replacing unsecured borrowing. Are we more secure? Are we more secure? A repo, the head of the repo dealers organization in London once said to me about repo, one of the wisest things really was a new idea to me, okay? And so I will share this idea to you. He said, it is sometimes very good business to do repo with a counterparty who's a good credit but has bad collateral. So you accept bad collateral from a good credit. It is never good business, okay, to do repo with a bad credit, even on the very best collateral. What this shows is that for the people who are actually doing this business, what they mean, these credits are not secured in the sense that you think, okay? The ideology of securing credits is not correct for how these instruments are being used, because the security you're offering is, if I don't perform, you can just keep the collateral. But I don't want the collateral. That I want you to perform. If I get the collateral, then I have to spend it or liquidate it or something like that. I don't want to even have to evaluate this collateral, and I have to figure out if you're screwing with me and giving me, this is not, it's fear of credit, not just by cryptos, but by the regulators in the global system. Okay, so what the cryptos are a symptom, as I say, of this moment in history where you can see the things that keep us up at night and keep our political leaders up at night. Okay, they're afraid of credit.
I've got two quick responses, but you want to go?
I couldn't agree more. And I think what's fascinating is that crypto originated in a non-collateralized framework, and now it's because of the scams, because of all the craziness, there is this sort of tendency now to collateralize everything as well. The asset-backed phenomenon, or the tokens that are redeemable in X service or utility. There's some sort of fundamental, tangible, underlying thing that is going to get you value from these tokens. But there is, fundamentally, it's all credit-based, because these securities, these assets most of the time they don't exist yet. There's no way of figuring out if they've really got them or not, and the cost of doing the due diligence in a global system where, you might be dealing with, you're in, Estonia, but you're buying cryptos being issued out of Kenya. I mean, it's impossible to do the due diligence. So I completely agree with that. But what's also interesting is that the crypto people are realizing there is a value to stability and non-volatility. And so the new rush of cryptocurrencies are so-called stable coins. And these are taking on bond-like ideas as well. So there's one that's just being launched called Basecoin, and they've basically discovered the art of duration. So they've realized that you can control the stability of your currency if you take supply in and out of the market by issuing bonds, which I think is just fascinating in the sense that they're effectively operating like a central bank without even knowing it. And then on the collateralization front, it's exactly what Perry was saying. They want to secure an asset pool which essentially constrains your capacity to use that capital in the real world. So what's the point, almost? And the Lightning Network is the scaling solution to Bitcoin, and that it's going to operate on a similar basis. The idea being that a bit of capital, a bit of Bitcoin will be secured forever in a bonded relationship, and as a result, that will create scale. Although I really don't think it will, but we'll see.
3 quick points. The first is, when you play poker, you don't play the other person's hand, you play the other person. And this idea that in financial markets you can just look at the quality of the collateral and not actually look at who's playing poker is sort of missing the point to me. And that more importantly, at the level Izabella is talking about, when you have blockchain or cryptocurrency infrastructure, this idea that there's nobody there who's sort of behind the wheel of that infrastructure has real systemic implications. And Angela Walsh, who's a great lawyer from Texas, has been beating this drum incessantly in the crypto world that if you don't have a fiduciary who's responsible for the management of important financial market infrastructure, you are designing bad financial market infrastructure. So there has to be somebody underlying not just the individual assets, the individual bilateral trade, but the actual platform. And this is sort of dealers in the regular financial markets are taking that role, which is why after the crisis you saw the systemic importance of dealers become...
And coders aren't taking responsibility.
And coders aren't taking responsibility because it's all anarchic. Yeah. And the difference here, the critical difference is the free software, the anarchic software vision of non-ownership was assets that had no monetary value. The whole point of Creative Commons and free software was these software licenses were not monetizable. But this is the exception that proves the rule, is that you're talking about financial assets that are supposed to have monetary value. You can't have nobody responsible, because if you don't have legal liability, you don't have legal value. And that's what they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. In regards to the geopolitics question, I didn't mean to be too glib, but I had a law professor at Columbia who wasn't Katarina Pistor, a finance law professor, and we had this conversation. I said, don't you think that the State Department should have been consulted before the swap lines were maybe instituted on a rainy Wednesday with a 2-page memorandum or whatever it was? And he said, I don't see international financial regulation as foreign policy. I said, what? When they shut down the banks in Iran in 1979, that seemed pretty foreign policy to me, don't you think? He said, oh, well, I guess that's a good point. This is an international finance lawyer of very high repute who doesn't even sort of think about this stuff in that way. And I think that there are people who do and will, and those people are going to be at the heads of intelligence agencies and the heads of military agencies. So the rest of us can hope that that's not happening, but it absolutely is happening. And the last thing about that is regards to the idea that financiers can say we're going to settle in different currencies depending on the jurisdiction. I think there is still depending on where we are and who we want to contract with, I think it's still important that there are jurisdictions. And the fact that there can be different jurisdictions doesn't mean that there isn't always some jurisdiction underlying all of these global financial contracts. They may be global in life, but when shit hits the fan, there's some court that they're going to go to, or an arbitration tribunal that is legitimate because of some treaty that some government has signed saying they get court-like functions. And in those situations, you're talking about legal debts, not just a spot transaction. And so while spot transactions can be conducted in anything, I can say I'm not going to give you this cup of water unless you give me 4 chickens named, Greg. If you take the water, or I give you the water and then you don't pay me those chickens and I go to court, I'm going to get damages in a nominal unit of account. I'm not going to get chickens necessarily from you unless we're maybe in the Court of Israel. But the idea there is that the legal tender, or what legally is determined as an acceptable means of settlement in a particular jurisdiction, still has relevance even in private financial contracts where people think that they are able to dictate all of the conditions of that contract. And the question of who has jurisdiction is an interesting legal question, and Annalise Riles has written on using a kind of private international law conflict of laws approach rather than the kind of global harmonization language that you see, for precisely the reason of preserving some autonomy at the state level beyond the central system. But I think that it definitely has that legal jurisdictional component.
One last question.
Yeah, I just want to join two thoughts, one by Mr. Mehrling and one by Rohan. And it's this comment about fear of credit by Professor Mehrling, and comments by Rohan about how contracts are interpreted if the circumstances have changed in such a way that they cannot be enforced or interpreted as originally intended. And I don't know how much what we are seeing today is fear of credit versus the consequences of a search for perfect
Certainty.
contract performance.
Yeah.
Particularly, I look at sovereign debt, and I look at the sanctity of contract doctrine and how that is being enforced in the litigations that are happening for sovereigns like Argentina. And what comes from this research and what comes from this literature is strong interpretation from the courts that are seeing these cases, be public courts or be private arbitrations. Strong interpretations in favor of sanctity of contract preservation versus acknowledging the possibility of the frustration of that contract. So I don't know if you can say anything on that regard.
To my mind, you're just pointing out two sides of the same coin. Okay, that when I say fear of credit, another thing that we're afraid of is basically radical uncertainty. The fact that we don't know the future. The reason that the credit has this quality is because we are promising to perform in a future whose sort of dimensions we don't know. We don't know those dimensions of our own personal lives. I may get hit by a bus and not be able to perform. It's not just that I'm a bad guy, that I'm not trustworthy. I may be completely trustworthy, but I may become just unable because of circumstances outside my control to do what I fully intended to do. Okay. Now, there's one more, but that's microeconomic. Macroeconomically, the only society we have is constructed from mutual promises to perform. Right? That's what holds the whole thing together. You make a promise to me, I make a promise to you, and based on your promise to me, I make a promise to somebody else, and the whole thing kind of gets put together. And if you don't perform, the whole thing can come unraveled. This is why financial crises are social crises, okay? Because you're unraveling the network of obligations. These are the most formal obligations we have, and so that's why they're enforceable in courts and things. We have lots of informal obligations, too, that also construct society. But when you start to lose the most hard contracts there are, what about these soft ones? They start to look a little dubious, too. So contracts, promises to pay, are the way we impose order on chaos. That's what And so fear of credit, okay, is kind of dangerous, because this is actually the way we create order in chaos. The notion that somehow by not ever making any promises to anybody, we'll all be free, I think is just not understanding the nature of reality. It's not correct, and it's dangerous.
Thank you.
Okay.
The speaker is going to be around today.
Yes, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, yeah.
And tomorrow too.
Yeah. And I will be coming. You want to advertise? Isn't there an afternoon session on cryptocurrency? Yeah, you mentioned at the beginning. So I'll be coming to that too. Cool.
Thank you.